The wind howled fiercely through the narrow streets of the small New England town of Montvale. It was December 24th, and the streets, usually bustling with last-minute holiday shoppers and cheerful carolers, were eerily silent. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, cloaking the town in a frigid white shroud. The only sound was the crunch of boots on the snow-covered sidewalks and the occasional clink of a bell when a door opened to release a gust of warm air before sealing itself against the blizzard outside. Among the rows of houses with their twinkling lights and wreath-adorned doors stood an old, creaky Victorian house on Willow Lane. It belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Harding, a retired schoolteacher with kind, tired eyes and a heart as vast as the ocean. Eleanor had been alone for the past 15 years, ever since her husband, Thomas, passed away during another bitterly cold winter. Despite the emptiness that sometimes wrapped around her heart, she kept her home warm and inviting, with garlands wound around the stairway banister and the scent of cinnamon always lingering in the air. That Christmas Eve, Eleanor sat in her armchair by the crackling fireplace, her gaze lost in the flickering flames. A radio on the side table softly played, "O Holy Night," its notes weaving through the room. She took a sip of her spiced tea, its warmth barely cutting through the chill that seemed to seep from her very bones. Outside, the storm worsened, wind whipping the bare branches of the old elm trees until they creaked like ship masts at sea. The world beyond the frosted window panes was a blur of white and shadow, a cold wilderness where only the foolish or desperate would venture out. But out there, trudging through the deepening snow, a tiny figure moved with determined, albeit faltering, steps. It was a kitten, no more than a few months old, with fur as gray as the storm clouds above and eyes like twin embers. She had been abandoned in an alleyway behind the bakery, where the scent of sugar and bread had once promised warmth and kindness. The kitten's soft mews were swallowed by the wind, her small body shivering uncontrollably as she pushed forward, driven by a will to survive. The kitten, whom fate had yet to name, paused beneath a lamppost where the light barely managed to cut through the snow. Her paws were raw from the icy terrain, and her whiskers, frozen stiff, trembled with each labored breath. She looked around, her vision blurring with exhaustion and the sting of the snowflakes that clung to her fur. Every instinct told her to lie down, to succumb to the cold that gnawed at her fragile frame. But somewhere in the distance, the faintest echo of a voice called out. It was as if the wind itself had whispered it to her, a promise of warmth and salvation. Meanwhile, Eleanor shifted in her chair, a strange heaviness pressing against her chest. It wasn't just loneliness this time. It was something deeper, a nameless sorrow that tightened her throat and brought an unbidden tear to her eye. She set her tea down, glancing at the clock on the mantel. It read 8:43 p.m. The night was still young, but each minute without her family or loved ones made the ticking feel like a countdown to a holiday that would pass unnoticed. Just then, a sound that didn't belong pierced the night. It was faint but distinct, the high-pitched, plaintive cry of a kitten. Eleanor's brows furrowed as she stood up, her joints protesting with every step as she moved to the window. She squinted, barely able to make out anything through the swirling snow. But there it was again, louder this time, a tiny meow so full of desperation that it cut through the storm and reached her very soul. Her heart clenched, and before she could second-guess herself, she grabbed her shawl, the wool blanket from the back of her chair, and her flashlight. The door groaned as she opened it, and a blast of icy air nearly knocked her backward. Yet she pressed on, each step sinking deep into the snow as she shone the beam of light into the darkness. "Hello? Is someone there?" Eleanor's voice trembled, carried away by the wind. She scanned the ground, moving with as much haste as her weary legs allowed, until the flashlight caught a pair of tiny, terrified eyes reflecting the light back at her. "Oh, heavens!" Eleanor gasped as she dropped to her knees, reaching out with gentle, trembling hands. The kitten was barely responsive, her fur matted with ice, her tiny body as light as a whisper in Eleanor's hands. She wrapped the kitten in the wool blanket and cradled her close, feeling the faintest flutter of life against her chest. There, little one," she murmured, tears brimming in her eyes as she hurried back to the house. "We'll get you warm, I promise." Eleanor shut the door behind her with a soft click, shutting out the storm. The kitten lay limply in her arms, eyes half closed. Yet there was a flicker of something in that tiny gaze, a silent trust, a fragile hope that seemed to echo in the room now filled with the faint, soft melody of silent night. Eleanor quickly set to work, her hands moving with an urgency she hadn't felt in years. She laid the kitten on the soft wool blanket by the fireplace, the glow casting a warm, golden hue over the fragile creature. The kitten's eyes fluttered open and closed, a small whimper escaping her as she shivered uncontrollably. Eleanor's heart ached at the sight, her mind flashing back to when she used to nurse injured birds and squirrels back to health as a young girl. This was different, though. The stakes felt higher, more personal, as if this kitten were a lifeline not only for itself but for Eleanor as well. "Stay with me, little one," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. She reached for a small dropper she kept in the kitchen and filled it with lukewarm milk, hoping it might coax the kitten to drink. Gently, she touched the dropper to the kitten's tiny mouth, holding her breath as a bead of milk rested on its lips. The kitten didn't respond at first, her eyes glazed and unfocused. But then, as if sensing that this was her chance at life, she opened her mouth just enough to let the milk slip in. Eleanor felt a surge of relief course through her as the kitten's small tongue flicked weakly at the dropper, accepting the nourishment. "There you go, sweetheart," Eleanor murmured, tears now freely rolling down her cheeks. She sat back, watching intently as the kitten slowly began to sip. With every tentative drop, a bit more color seemed to return to the kitten's face, though her small body still trembled with cold. Eleanor wrapped the blanket more snugly around the kitten, carefully placing a hand on her side to provide warmth and comfort. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind shrieking like a wild thing, shaking the shutters and sending sharp taps of sleet against the window panes. Yet inside, an unspoken bond was forming. The kitten, with her fragile life hanging by a thread, and Eleanor, whose loneliness had long weighed heavy in the corners of her heart, found themselves entwined in a shared moment of need. The old woman settled into the chair next to the fireplace, eyes never leaving her tiny guest. She began to hum softly, a lullaby she hadn't sung in decades, the notes shaky at first but gradually finding their strength. It was a song she used to sing to her son, Henry, when he was just a baby, long before he moved away to pursue dreams that took him too far to return for the holidays. As the hours ticked by, the storm outside showed no signs of relenting. Eleanor stifled a yawn, the adrenaline that had coursed through her earlier now ebbing away, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. The kitten had managed to drink a bit more milk, her breathing steadier now, though her eyes still closed between sips. Eleanor stroked the kitten's head, marveling at the softness of its fur despite the ice that had matted it earlier. It was as though the tiny creature carried both fragility and resilience in equal measure. "I'll call you Miracle," Eleanor said softly, a small smile playing on her lips. The kitten stirred, eyes opening just enough to meet Eleanor's gaze, and for the first time, there was a spark there, tiny but unmistakable. It was a moment that filled the room with something more profound than warmth. It was hope, as delicate and persistent as the snowflakes that now gently kissed the window. Just then, a sudden knock at the door made Eleanor jump. Her heart thudded in her chest, the sound so foreign that for a moment, she wondered if she'd imagined it. But it came again, firmer this time, reverberating through the quiet of the house. She looked at the clock, 10:15 p.m. Who could possibly be out in this storm? Clutching her shawl tighter around her, she rose and went to the door. The kitten's eyes followed her, tiny paws twitching as if aware of the disruption. Eleanor opened the door a crack, and a rush of wind blew snowflakes into her face, making her squint against the cold. Standing in the doorway was a man, bundled in a thick parka with a scarf covering most of his face. He looked up, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, with a gasp that caught in her throat, Eleanor recognized the familiar brown eyes, the lines around them deeper now but unmistakably those of her son. "Henry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. He nodded, eyes glassy with unshed tears, and stepped forward to embrace her. The cold melted between them as Eleanor's arms wrapped around him, the years of silence and distance falling away like the snow outside. "I came as soon as I could, Mom," Henry said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I couldn't let another Christmas go by." Eleanor pulled back, eyes searching his face for signs of the young boy she used to cradle. "You're here now, and that's all that matters," she said, a smile breaking through the disbelief. Henry's gaze drifted past his mother's shoulder and landed on the tiny bundle by the fire. "What's this?" he asked, moving inside and closing the door behind him. Eleanor followed his eyes and felt her heart swell. "That's Miracle," she said, a warmth spreading through her chest. "She found me tonight. Or perhaps I found her." Henry knelt by the fireplace, carefully reaching out to stroke the kitten's head. Miracle blinked slowly, her tiny nose quivering as if to say she recognized a safe hand when she felt one. In that moment, as the storm outside softened into a quiet snowfall, the old house on Willow Lane was filled with the kind of peace that defies words. Eleanor looked at her son, then at the kitten who had brought them together, and felt a gratitude so deep it left her breathless. The silence between them spoke of forgiveness, of second chances, and of the miracles that sometimes arrive wrapped in fur, with eyes that reflect both innocence and survival. The wind outside had calmed, tapering into a steady whisper that rattled the icicles hanging from the eaves. Inside, the warmth of the fire mixed with the subtle glow of the Christmas tree lights, casting soft shadows that danced on the old floral wallpaper. Eleanor sat down beside Henry on the rug, their knees almost touching as they watched Miracle, who had fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep. The kitten's tiny chest rose and fell, her whiskers twitching as she dreamed, perhaps of simpler days when warmth and food were as certain as her mother's purr. Henry let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since he arrived. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his mother's, wrapping it in his own. Eleanor's eyes widened at the gesture. It had been years since he'd touched her so tenderly, and the sudden closeness brought a fresh sting of tears to her eyes. "I didn't think you'd come," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The pain of too many silent Christmases echoed in her words, and Henry heard it. He winced, his brows knitting together as he looked down at their joined hands. "I almost didn't," he admitted, his voice raw and low. "But then the storm hit, and it was like something was telling me I couldn't wait another day." His gaze lifted to the kitten, now curled into the wool blanket. "And I guess you had your own little miracle show up," Eleanor chuckled softly, the sound fragile and full of wonder. "She's special, isn't she? Just a tiny thing, yet brave enough to fight through that storm alone." Henry's eyes darkened, a shadow of guilt passing over them. "I know what it's like to fight through a storm alone," he said, so quietly that Eleanor almost didn't catch it. But she did, and the weight of his confession settled heavily between them. Her heart twisted as she realized that this wasn't just about physical distance. Henry had been carrying a storm inside him, one she hadn't known about, one he hadn't been able to share until now. Eleanor squeezed his hand, urging him silently to continue. Henry's eyes met hers, filled with a vulnerability she hadn't seen since he was a boy with scraped knees and tear-streaked cheeks. "After Dad passed," Henry started, his voice breaking, "I felt like I had to be strong for both of us. I didn't want you to see me fall apart, so I left. I thought if I could just get away, build a life, I'd find some way to fill the hole he left. But the more years that passed, the harder it got to come back. The guilt kept growing until it was easier to stay away than to face you." Eleanor's breath caught, the truth of his words piercing her. She had spent so many years feeling abandoned, not realizing that he had been struggling just as much, if not more. All those Christmases she'd spent waiting for his call, sending letters that only sometimes got replies. She'd never guessed that each unanswered word weighed on him, too. "You never had to be strong alone," Eleanor whispered, her eyes wet and glistening in the firelight. "I thought you stayed away because you'd moved on. I never realized that I was part of what kept you away." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with regret, but also with the faintest glimmer of understanding. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if awaiting what would come next. Before either could say more, a soft sound drew their attention. Miracle had stirred, her eyes slowly opening, the deep golden glow now brighter than before. She looked between the two humans, her small body uncurling just enough to stretch a paw towards Henry's hand, resting next to her on the blanket. It was a gesture so pure, so unguarded, that it broke through the tension like a shaft of sunlight piercing a storm cloud. Henry laughed, the sound rough and unpracticed but sincere. He rubbed the kitten's tiny head with the pad of his finger, the soft fur warming his skin in a way he hadn't felt in years. The kitten's purr was tentative at first, as if she, too, was testing the waters, but soon it grew, filling the room with its gentle, rhythmic hum. Eleanor watched them both, the threads of her heart beginning to weave together, patching up the old tears that loss had made. "She chose you," Eleanor said with a small smile, watching as Miracle nestled against Henry's hand. The kitten's eyes met his, and for a moment, it felt as if she were urging him to forgive himself, to take the love that was being offered freely. Henry looked up at his mother, a tear slipping down his cheek before he could wipe it away. Maybe this is where I'm supposed to be," he said, his voice thick with the realization that home wasn't just a place, but a space filled with the people and creatures willing to share in your storms and your silences. Eleanor leaned forward, her arms wrapping around her son's shoulders as Miracle mewed softly between them, her purr unwavering. The house, which had once seemed so hollow and haunted, felt whole again, as if the warmth of the kitten's small body had seeped into the walls themselves, breathing life back into its old wooden bones. Outside, the snow had begun to settle, its chaotic dance now a serene blanket that glistened under the pale moonlight. The storm had passed, leaving in its wake a town coated in silvery calm. And in the heart of Willow Lane, under the roof of a once lonely Victorian house, a different kind of storm had finally found its peace. The hours that followed felt almost surreal. Henry and Eleanor sat together, talking softly as the fire crackled and glowed, their words filling the room like stitches closing an old wound. The house that had felt so silent for so long was alive again, each whispered story and shared memory acting as a balm for both of their hearts. Miracle, now warm and fed, stretched out contentedly between them, her tiny body radiating a comfort that only something so pure and vulnerable could provide. The storm outside had dwindled into a soft flurry, and the gentle patter of snow against the window created a soothing backdrop to their conversation. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt the tension ease from her shoulders, the heaviness in her chest lifting as she listened to Henry recount stories from his life. Stories he had never shared, filled with moments of success, loneliness, and the little everyday miracles he'd taken for granted. And then, one day, Henry continued, a small smile playing on his lips. "I passed by a shelter. There was this little cat, just like Miracle, but older, sitting by the window and staring out like he was waiting for someone. It made me stop, you know? I hadn't planned on going inside, but I did. I petted that cat, Mom, and I felt this, I don't know, connection? Like maybe he was waiting for me all along. But I didn't take him. I walked out, and I kept walking, just like I'd been doing for years." Eleanor's eyes softened, her hand moving instinctively to rest on Henry's arm. "But you came back. That's what matters now." Henry looked down at Miracle, who had curled up into a tiny, gray ball on his lap, her purrs steady and soothing. "Yeah," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I came back." As dawn approached, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the frosty edges of the window, casting long shadows that crept across the room. It was Christmas morning. Eleanor rose from the floor, her joints protesting, but the warmth in her heart made the ache bearable. She walked to the kitchen, her feet sinking into the thick, worn rug that covered the floor. The aroma of coffee soon filled the air, rich and inviting, mingling with the subtle scent of pine from the Christmas tree. Henry shifted, gently moving Miracle from his lap to the blanket by the fire. The kitten stirred, mewing softly before tucking her head back under her paw and resuming her sleep. He stood and followed his mother into the kitchen, leaning against the doorway as he watched her prepare 2 mugs. "It's been years since I woke up to the smell of your coffee," Henry said, a wistful smile tugging at his lips. Eleanor looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears and something else, joy. "It's been years since I had someone to share it with," she replied, pushing one of the steaming cups toward him. They sat at the small kitchen table, the silence between them now filled with comfort instead of distance. Eleanor reached for the basket of Christmas ornaments on the counter, a tradition she had kept even in the years she spent Christmas alone. She pulled out an old, glass ornament shaped like an angel, the paint chipped from decades of use. "You remember this?" she asked, holding it up to the light where it caught the sun and scattered tiny rainbows across the walls. Henry's eyes widened, a genuine laugh escaping him. "I do. I remember dropping it and crying because I thought I'd broken Christmas," he said, chuckling. "But Dad just glued it back together and told me Christmas wasn't in the decorations. It was in the people we love." Eleanor nodded, the memory now bittersweet but no longer painful. He was right. And this year, we have a new little miracle to remind us of that. As if summoned by the sound of her name, Miracle trotted into the kitchen, her movements more confident now. She looked up at them, tail swishing as if to say, "What's next?" Henry bent down, scooping the kitten up into his arms. He scratched under her chin, and she responded with a pleased purr, nuzzling into the crook of his neck. Eleanor watched the interaction, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. This tiny creature had brought them back together, stitching their broken pieces with the simplest threads of hope and need. The morning stretched on, each moment gilded with the warmth of rekindled connection. Henry insisted on helping Eleanor with breakfast, and soon the kitchen was filled with the sizzle of bacon and the soft hum of Christmas music playing from the old radio. Miracle weaved between their feet, her small form darting in and out of shadows, always returning to where the warmth was. It was as if she were part of the house now, an unspoken symbol of resilience and the power of second chances. As they sat down to eat, Eleanor glanced out the window. The neighborhood was blanketed in snow, pristine and glittering in the morning light. The chaos of the storm had passed, leaving behind a scene so peaceful it seemed almost sacred. Children's laughter echoed from the houses nearby as they woke up to stockings and gifts, their excitement audible even through the walls. But inside the old house on Willow Lane, the greatest gift of all was intangible. It was the return of a son, the renewal of hope, and the simple, enduring reminder that love could heal wounds even the fiercest of storms had carved. Henry looked up from his plate, meeting Eleanor's gaze with a mixture of relief and resolve. "Mom, I'm not going anywhere this time. I want to be here, to be part of this." Eleanor felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. It was a tear born of joy, not sorrow. "And I want nothing more than for you to stay," she said, her voice steady, rich with emotion. Miracle, now perched on the edge of Henry's chair, gave a tiny, approving chirp, as if sealing the promise between them. And in that moment, as the sunlight streamed into the kitchen and wrapped around them like an embrace, it was clear. This Christmas, in a house once hollow with loss, had become a testament to love, reunion, and the quiet, unassuming miracle of a kitten who had refused to let go of life. As the day unfolded, the warmth in Eleanor's home felt like a beacon, defying the chill outside. The storm that had once roared so viciously now seemed a distant memory, its remnants glistening peacefully under the winter sun. Miracle had taken her place in their lives as naturally as if she'd always been there, bounding between Henry's feet as he moved around the living room, or nuzzling into Eleanor's lap with a soft purr that resonated through the room like a hymn. They spent the afternoon sharing stories, pulling out old photo albums, and rediscovering memories that had long been tucked away. Henry's laughter, so familiar yet so rare in recent years, filled the space, blending with the crackle of the fire and the soft thump of Miracle chasing a ribbon across the floor. Eleanor watched her son, seeing not just the man he had become, but the boy he once was, the child she'd loved fiercely, who had come back to her at last. As dusk settled in, casting a soft, violet hue over the snow-covered town, Eleanor placed a final log on the fire and sat back, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Henry sat beside her, their silence now one of contentment, not the strained quiet of before. Miracle curled up between them, her small body a warm reminder of the night that had changed everything. "Funny how life works," Eleanor murmured, her eyes reflecting the fire's glow. "Sometimes, miracles come in the smallest packages." Henry nodded, his gaze distant but peaceful. "Yeah," he said, glancing at the kitten, whose tiny presence had bridged the gap between them. "And sometimes, they come when you need them most." The room seemed to agree, the soft rustle of the curtains in the evening breeze a gentle sigh of contentment. And as the first stars appeared in the deepening sky, twinkling like tiny promises, the house on Willow Lane, once quiet and lonely, stood as a testament to resilience, love, and the simple truth that even the smallest life could change everything. In that warm, glowing room, with the Christmas tree casting colorful lights across their faces and the sound of miracles filling the spaces where silence used to be, Eleanor felt a joy so complete it brought tears to her eyes. This year, Christmas hadn't been about gifts or decorations. It had been about finding each other, forgiving the past, and recognizing the miracle that love, unseen and unyielding, truly is. And so, on that sacred, silent night, with her son at her side and a kitten curled into her lap, Eleanor closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer of gratitude, knowing that this moment, this feeling, was the real miracle of Christmas.